Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Personal Statement webinar today. I'm Erin Reichelt, and I am the pre-law advisor for the University of Minnesota. I work with students and alums. I recognize lots of names in the attendee list today, so thank you all for joining me. We're going to talk today about personal statements, and then also we're going to talk about the other essays that go into a law school application. So I'll try to cover a lot here today. And if you do have questions as I'm going through, I'm the only one monitoring the chat, so I have it open and I can see it, but I'll try to look at it throughout to make sure that I'm answering questions that come up. You can put your questions either in the chat or in the Q&A box. Either way is fine. So we will go ahead and dive in now. So personal statements are usually, for a lot of people, the toughest part of a law school application. It's always really tough to write these statements. I definitely acknowledge that. Law schools know that too, but they are a really important element of your application. Um, and yes, I do think that this would probably be helpful for students applying to other graduate programs. However, I am going to specifically talk mostly about personal statements with respect to law school. There are some differences between law school personal statements and other grad schools. So I'll address that in a bit. So personal statements tend to address why you are applying to law school or graduate school. Why is now the right time for you? What your strengths, your goals are, and how they relate to the graduate program that you're applying to. And what makes you a strong candidate for a law school. The law schools also use these essays to really address how you would be a member of, oh, sorry, I do want to be showing you the slides. Thanks for that, Grace. Let me try again. Thanks. Hold on, everyone. Okay. Someone let me know if you can see my email inbox now or in the slides. I mean, great. Sorry about that. Hopefully you enjoyed the view into my email inbox. So anyway, we are going to talk a little bit about what personal statements are meant to address. What they're not meant to address is ultimately, for law school at least, exactly what you want to do in your future career. So this is actually something that makes law school personal statements really different from a lot of other graduate programs that do explicitly want you to talk about why you are applying to that program and what you want to do after it. Law schools generally assume you're going to law school to be a lawyer. You're going to law school because you want to be an attorney, and that you might not know exactly what type of attorney that you want to be yet, but that's okay. They understand that most people who go to law school end up changing their mind, end up maybe interested in one area of law and then change to a different area of law, and that's okay. Many other graduate programs do actually very explicitly want you to talk about your research goals, your career goals, and that's very different from a law school personal statement. So how a personal statement is used in the law school admissions process. Generally, personal statements are used as a way to figure out who you are as a person, which sounds really generic and cheesy, but it is true. It's the only element sometimes of an entire application that's written in your voice, that's meant to show the admissions committee who you are outside of your numbers. So it's designed to show something that is not otherwise reflected in the rest of your application. Nothing that they would see by just reading your transcript or your resume. It's not designed to be something that's supposed to be a paragraph version of your resume. It's supposed to show something different and some aspect of your personality, and to even talk more about your individual, your thoughts, your feelings, your beliefs, and your goals that wouldn't be reflected elsewhere in your application. It's also designed to be a writing sample. Law is a big part of a legal career is writing and being a concise and direct writer and addressing specific aspects of things in a very short way. So that's why they're asking you to do all of this in 2 pages double spaced in some cases. So I also like to think of an application as an entire piece all together. And the personal statement is only one portion of that puzzle piece, and the whole thing all together should really address, why is law school right for you? Why are you going right now? But that is not only going to be addressed by the personal statement. If the rest of your application might make it a little confusing about why you might be applying to law school, if you're coming from maybe a different background, if you have a very extensive career in another area, it might be really helpful to more explicitly address why you're applying to law school and why right now in your personal statement. But in other cases, if you have a lot of background on your resume and your transcript and law related things, that's going to be very obvious to the admissions committee. So in terms of getting started, we're going to dive into each of these elements in more detail, but we'll talk about how to get started, how to know yourself, following instructions, developing a theme, an outline, how to structure your draft, and then how to get feedback. So first, a really important part of any personal statement process is actually addressing who you are and reflecting on the experiences that you've had. Why would you be a successful student in this program? Knowing your strengths, and then also some of your areas for growth. Again, the personal statement is something that is in your voice. It is only written by you. So showing your personal statement from a place of strength can be helpful, even if you're talking about barriers that you've overcome or struggles that you faced in the past. Ideally, from reading the personal statement, you might talk specifically about 1 or 2 or 3 even experiences that you've had that showcase why you would be a successful student in this program. Those experiences don't need to be related to law. They don't need to be the only law related experience you've ever had. It can be any number of things, ranging from an experience that you've had, managing a student group, planning an event for an internship, managing a project that you did at work, a experience in your personal life that it had you interact with maybe with the legal field in some way. But it should ideally be a experience that was unique to you, that only you could write about. So not you observing someone else's experience. All right, and so the other thing that comes into that when I talk about choosing an experience to write about is thinking about your audience. Who's going to read this personal statement? And in law schools, generally speaking, it's at least one person in an admissions office, and often multiple people, and often faculty members too. So thinking about the tone of your personal statement. You can talk about really personal things, but the people reading your statement are strangers. They are people who don't know you at all, and this is their first introduction to you as a member of the legal profession. So thinking about the tone of your personal statement and what you're comfortable sharing. You don't need to feel pressured to share things that you don't want to. So even if you have a situation where you had, for example, extensive experience with the legal system, if you don't want to write about that in your personal statement, you don't have to. There are other aspects of the application where if you as an individual were interacting with the legal system, as in you were charged with a crime or had some situation like that, that might come up in the character and fitness section of your application, but that doesn't mean that you need to feel like you have to write about it in the personal statement. So it is really important to write this in a way that acknowledges that the people who are reading your statement don't know you and they don't know your background. So following instructions, this is something that sounds really simple, but something that a lot of people don't think about until after they've written a draft. So Each school will have a personal statement prompt, and you can find that prompt typically within either their admissions website. Sometimes they write the prompt on there, other times they might not, and it's only within their actual application within the Law School Admission Council website that you can actually find what they want you to say, what their length requirement is, what their formatting instructions are. And if you've written a 4 or 5 page personal statement and that law school says that it has to be 2 pages double spaced, that's really valuable to know that before you get started. Some law schools will be very, very clear on margins, font size, page length, word count even. So read those instructions before you start. Most personal statement prompts are intentionally vague, which we'll look at a few prompts in a bit. And some of them do have more specific questions in their prompt and that they want you to customize it to each school, for example. So not every law school will actually ask you to customize it to the school. And if they don't ask that, that's not, you can do that, but it's not a requirement if they aren't asking you to do that. So, but some law schools really will ask you to customize it to the school. And if you don't do that, that can be a little bit of a red flag to them that you aren't, it might indicate to them that you aren't really serious about attending that school. All right, so when thinking about a theme to your personal statement, generally people write many personal statements center around some experience that the individual has had. Um, and ultimately, I think focusing on what you learned from that experience, how that experience is unique to you. And so that's what I mean by memorable, not coming up with something that you think is really extraordinary, because many people have not had extraordinary experiences. Some people have, and that's wonderful, but that doesn't mean that you need to be like reaching for an extraordinary experience that isn't authentic to your story. So the way that you're memorable is by making it true to you and true to your story and unique to your experience. Um, I also think that in general, keeping a personal statement positive, so speaking from a place of strength, and sometimes that might mean starting from where you are at now as you are writing your application to law school and backing into maybe an experience that was less positive. When you're asked to talk about overcoming an obstacle, for example, focusing more on the overcoming part and who you are now as a result of that experience versus giving the details of the obstacle itself and the situation that you faced. Because ultimately law schools want to know who you are now and who you will be entering into their law school class. All right, talking about an outline. So an outline works for some people, it doesn't work for others. So you don't need to feel pressured to write an outline if that's not the way that you create or not the way that you typically write. But thinking through some of these questions can be helpful. So thinking about how you want to structure your statement. How do you want to order information? And so this goes back to what I was talking about on the last slide, where I mentioned um, if you're talking about a situation that happened in the past, which most of you will, and especially if that's a situation that happened long ago, do you want to start in the situation in that by writing about something chronologically, or do you want to start with who you are now? Each can work in different ways, but it's really valuable to think through that in advance, or to even try writing it in a number of different ways to see how you feel about it. How do you start your personal statement? So what can you say to get the reader invested into your story? And that does not mean that you need to artificially create an attention grabbing introduction that is not relevant to the rest of your statement. It means, what can you say to get the reader into your story or into your experience? Because one like kind of pet peeve, I guess, of people who are reading personal statements often is an intro that has nothing to do with the rest of the statement, but feels like it's written um, just to be attention grabbing without anything to back it up. So you don't need to create that. if that's not authentic to your story. If it is, great, but make sure that it really is true to the story that you're telling. And it's okay to just kind of launch right into it. You don't, it's again, this is a really short statement. So typical rules of an intro and a conclusion and body paragraphs, it might work for you, but that is not the only way to write a statement. Also thinking about if you have multiple points to make or multiple experiences that you want to talk about, how do you jump from one point to the next and make sure you're giving appropriate context to each? And so many people start out by wanting to talk about many different things at once and quickly realize that this is a short statement, might be better to focus narrowly. It works in some cases to talk about multiple things, but it doesn't for everyone. And remember that this is one aspect of your of your application. It does not need to cover every aspect of who you are in this one statement. They've got a lot of other things that they're looking at too. They're looking at your letters, they're looking at other optional essays, which we'll talk about in a bit. They're looking at your transcript and your resume. So if you've got some things already reflected in other aspects of your statement, you don't need to feel pressured to write about every single thing in your personal statement. And then the part that I think is almost the hardest for most people is how to finish. So I read a lot of statements that are really awesome. And then the last paragraph is like, we'll insert conclusion later because it's hard to figure out how to finish it. And so how do you finish on a strong note? How do you tie up what did you learn? What were the challenges you faced? And what are you bringing to a law school's community? A lot of people do finish by talking specifically about the law school that they're applying to, by talking about how they fit with either the school's mission or how the experiences that they've had would contribute to even a specific program or clinic that the school offers. So that is one way to finish, but that's not the only way either. Tying it back to the theme too, and if you started by talking about something, it is helpful to kind of wrap it up in a similar way or reference even the introduction that you had. So that's one way to wrap it up. But it is something that a lot of people don't do well, I guess. So devote just as much time to finishing your statement strong as you did to your introduction. So thinking about how to get feedback. So getting feedback on your personal statement is really important and something to build in time for. So don't send a statement to someone expecting that all they'll do is just say, yep, looks great. They're probably going to give you some feedback and it's going to take you some time to go through all of that to figure out what you want to, what you want to integrate into your draft. It's your draft, so you don't need to integrate anything that anyone else says. But if you are getting feedback and hearing this from multiple people, sometimes it's helpful to take that in and figure out how you might want to change your draft. I always recommend doing 3 reviewers at a minimum. So someone solid in editing. That can be the Writing Center at the University of Minnesota if you are a current student. If you are not a current student, you don't have access to the Writing Center. And so there's a lot of, even if you know someone that's really strong in editing, that's great. There is a lot of really affordable editing services that you can submit your personal statement to online that just look at it for grammar, for typos, for flow. And then someone knowledgeable in the law admissions industry. Typically, that's me for many applicants who are entering from the University of Minnesota, who are either students or alums. I will review up to 2 drafts per applicant. So once you get to me, try to have it be in a pretty good place. So having a few other people review it prior to me is helpful. But again, anticipate that there may be some significant revisions after talking to me too. Not always, but sometimes. So don't be surprised if that happens. And then finally, but probably most importantly, is someone who knows you really well, someone who knows that this sounds like you, that you're not kind of trying to sound like someone you're not sounding authentic to your story. And that's just as important because that's what the law schools want. They want to hear from you. They want to hear who you are and they want to get a sense of your personality from this. All right, let's look at some example personal statement prompts. And the first one is from the University of Minnesota. Most people that I work with who are undergrads or alums of the U are planning on applying to the University of Minnesota's law school. And their personal statement prompt is pretty clear about length. They're talking about what they're wanting to get out of it. They're wanting an introduction to you. They're also giving you some ideas of things you might write about. So this is an example of a longer personal statement prompt where they're giving you a little bit more context. So one question that I just got also is, if you write 2 versions of your statement, can you send that to me? And so this is kind of, I usually do this on a case-by-case basis, but typically if you've got 2 versions and you want to talk through them, I can certainly do that. If you have both already, it's probably helpful to set up an appointment. I do prefer for first drafts to do those in a synchronous appointment. So we've got in-person, phone, Zoom appointments available. And that way we can talk through which version's working better, which isn't, what are some aspects of maybe both that you can integrate with each other. But certainly that's something that I have often done. And there's many times I will go through multiple essays in one appointment, because as we will see soon, and you can see on the screen that optional statements are pretty regularly submitted too. So if you have a diversity statement and a personal statement and an addendum and a character and fitness situation, sometimes it's helpful to see all of those together so we can talk about how you are presenting yourself as a full applicant. So yes, I'm not like super strict about the 2 drafts. It's mostly just that if you've got a first draft, maybe a few different versions of it. And then once we talk about that, a second draft, often I will do the second draft over email. But if you prefer doing an appointment, that's fine with me too. All right, so this is the University of Minnesota's prompt. Like I said, most law schools will have a pretty strict length requirement, 2 pages double spaced. Many will accept more. The longest one I've seen, some do say that they don't have a length requirement. I don't think most of the time, in most cases, more than 3 pages is anything anyone wants to read or is necessary, especially if you're submitting other essays. The next example I wanted to show, just because it's an example of a non-specific prompt, is Georgetown's. So Georgetown's is like, write about whatever you want, just double space it, and they don't give a length requirement. But generally speaking, 3 pages is a good length if you can keep it to that. I think Berkeley's says 4. That's the longest one I've seen. Again, sometimes they won't say anything, but really try to keep it concise. These people are reading thousands of applications, and it's, if you're applying to more than one place, you're probably going to have a 2-page version anyway. So brainstorming topics. So when you have almost nothing to go on, when you can see their prompt and their instructions, they don't give you much to go on, and they do that intentionally. They want to see what you're going to come up with for what you think that they should know about. And so this is where it's helpful to think about some experiences where you were challenged and you learned something. And think of it almost like, what would you talk about in a job interview? What would you talk about if you were applying for a position at a law firm as like a paralegal, and they asked you, tell me about a time where you learned something? Then think about what you might say for that answer, and that might be something to think about for a personal statement then. Another question I just got is, if you do have a 2-page personal statement, how much should you consider extending those for prompts that offer longer page restrictions? And that's a great question. If you feel like you did if you have presented your best self or your best story in 2 pages and you feel pretty good about that, that's fine. You can certainly just submit that for anyone, even if they do have a longer page requirement. That's pretty common. But if you do feel like you had to make some significant cuts and like the 3-page version better, then if that's an option for law schools, by all means, do submit that uh, to or longer personal statement. Um, and also consider though that there are optional essays. There are other essays that you can submit so that you don't need to feel like you have to get everything into the personal statement. Um, other things in terms of just returning back to topics, a lot of law schools will tell you in their prompt that they want you to talk about any hardships that you've overcome, any barriers that you've faced, any goals that you've achieved. So I've seen a lot of people that have done personal statements on things like training for a marathon or doing a yoga instructor training, like some sort of physical thing that was really difficult for them, so they can talk about what they learned, how they were challenged, and what strengths show up in that experience. um, that's not relevant to everyone, obviously. Many people have not done that, but I've also seen people talk about learning a language, or learning to play an instrument, or being challenged with even starting a new job and figuring out how to interact with new coworkers, for example. So it can be kind of all over the place. There's not one right thing to write about. It's mostly what is authentic to your story and what is something that you can tell a compelling story about. So that's just an intro into brainstorming topics. Everyone who's on this webinar or who registered, I will send out a brainstorming worksheet that we do have. That can be a really helpful way of thinking through, like, okay, what are three situations that I can think about that that I've had in my life that I could write about, and then asks you some further questions about them to help you kind of dig into what you might write about. Um, Reading personal statement examples can be helpful but also dangerous, so be cautious about reading too many examples prior to thinking about what you might want to write about yourself, because those statements are sometimes a little unrealistic for many people. So not everyone is a concert pianist, for example. Not everyone has started some sort of nonprofit organization at the age of 17. Like, it's not a common experience. If you did that, great. I think you're probably like set on what you're going to write about, but that's not always a common experience. I am going to send with the slides and the recording some examples I think are more approachable and typical. So that might help in terms of thinking about what to talk about. If you're really struggling too, you can always make an appointment with me just to talk about brainstorming topics and thinking through this for yourself too, because this is something that I'm happy to talk about. My appointments at this right now, like in late September, are tend to be pretty get a little backed up. But if you're not in a huge rush and you can wait to have that conversation with me, that's something I'm happy to do. We also do have a lot of other ways that you can even interact with each other at pre-law society meetings. We have a law school fair coming up next week where you can get some input from admissions people themselves about what to write about. So anyway, I know this is it's tough to think of what to write about, but that's kind of the biggest piece of it. And once you have a topic, hopefully the brainstorming worksheet will also help you to kind of go from there with what to do after you think of your topic and what to write about. All right, optional essays. So optional essays are optional. As the name implies, you do not have to submit these. You do not need to feel like you have to go into go and write any of these statements. However, if you do have other things that you want to share that you're feeling really restricted by the personal statement, these can be a great opportunity for you to tell more aspects of your story and share more about who you are. So optional essays fall into a few different categories. The first is addenda. Addenda is kind of a catch-all word that means that you are submitting something that may answer a question that comes up in your application. So examples of addenda are okay, I took the LSAT once, and then I took it again, and my score jumped or fell significantly, more than 5 points in either direction. And the admissions people reading that or seeing that might think, huh, what's up with that? Like, what happened there? And the addenda is meant to answer that question without them having to create some scenario in their mind. What happened? And the answer might be as simple as I didn't study the first time and then I did. And that's really it. They can be very short. They're often even just a paragraph. Other examples of addenda are things like, I really struggled my freshman year. I was not in the right major. I had difficulties adjusting to college, and my GPA was significantly different my first year of undergrad than it was after that. Or I have a whole semester's worth of W's because I had a health issue that came up or a family issue that came up that semester. It also might address, okay, I transferred institutions 3 or 4 times before I finished my degree, or I had a significant gap in education. So again, just answering a question, what happened with this? What was, if you had a gap in your employment, and I mean by like a multiple years, it might address that. You don't need to write addenda about everything. Like for example, if you had 1 B on your transcript, but the rest are A's, you don't need to write an addenda about that. It's fine. It's totally okay. If you had 1 F or D, maybe yes, write about that grade if that's a significant outlier in what you typically, how you typically perform. But that's one option to write. Again, it doesn't have to be long, generally will be under a page. And sometimes if you have multiple situations you need to write about, you may need to combine those into 1 page because the law school might only let you upload 1 addenda, but that's okay. You can still include multiple different situations on there. Diversity statements are accepted at, I think, virtually every law schools. That prompt is typically what diverse perspectives do you bring to our law school? So that's intentionally vague and can be written from a number of different perspectives. So if you have something related to your identity that you want to talk about, that you feel makes a difference in, you know, how you've experienced your life, what you would bring to a law school, then that's something that you certainly have the opportunity to talk about in a diversity statement. Typically, those are a max of 2 pages. Sometimes the school will want it to be only 1 page, so you don't have a lot of space there. But if you wanted to write about your identity, and or yeah, just, I mean, I've seen people talk about their racial identity. I've seen them talk about sexual orientation, about where geographically where they lived, like if they grew up in a rural setting. I've seen people talk about socioeconomic status. So a lot of different things that you can integrate into that. And if you have a lot of, like many of those things that you would want to write about, it's fine if your diversity statement's a little longer than a page. They want you to be, to give them the information that they need to know more about you. Another optional essay that you can submit is a why are you applying to this law school? Sometimes that is listed as an optional essay that you can write in. For example, both Georgetown and University of Michigan have about 5 or 6 different optional essays. One of them is why Georgetown or why Michigan, but then there's like 6 other ones. And you don't need to feel like you have to do the why Michigan essay. You can do any of their optional essays, and that still shows that you're interested in that school and that you're very committed, I guess, to going there. Again, these are optional, but if you're, again, really serious about going to a school, I would probably make an effort to submit one of their optional essays. And then again, the school specific essays, those are the ones like the ones I mentioned at Georgetown and Michigan, where they really clearly have questions that are specific to the school. Another example is the Yale 250 essay. So it's the 250 word essay on whatever you want. Separate from a diversity statement, separate from a personal statement. But that's where you are talking about, and it's typically issue-based and more academic in nature. They are a more academically oriented law school, so that's usually what they want, but it's open-ended for a reason. They want to see what you choose to write about for those. So um, that's a like very brief overview of optional essays. Does anyone have any questions about optional essays before I move on? Just gonna give it a second while I take a drink of water to see if anybody has any questions. None seen at this point, so I will move on. All right, so this is an example of, for those of you who like to have a little bit more direction on how to write the statement, but if you like a outline, so how to actually start the personal statement, what the body paragraphs might talk about, what the conclusion would talk about. So this is, you can look at this in a little bit more detail when you get the slides and the recording, but this is just an example of how some might structure the statement. This is not a requirement. You do not have to structure your statement in this way, but you can use this as a model. Some frequently asked questions that I will go through. And again, if you have any additional questions, please do put them in the chat. So how do I choose which stories to share and how in depth should I go? So I talked about this a little bit in the brainstorming topics section, but again, this is 100% your story. You don't have to talk about anything you don't want to talk about. For example, just an example, if you had a very traumatic experience where you were interacting with the legal field, but you don't like to talk about it, which is fine. You don't have to feel like you have to talk about it. This is not a thing where if you've experienced some sort of trauma that you need to feel like you have to parade it in front of the admissions committees to be admitted. You do not have to do that. And so don't feel like this is something you have to share. You get to choose what you write about and how in depth you go. If you want to write about that situation, again, sharing explicit or difficult to read details, do so with extreme caution, because again, this is something that an admissions committee is reviewing as a way to admit you into a profession that is fairly, I use the word conservative not to mean political leaning, but to mean resistant to change. So be cautious about how you're explaining everything, because you don't know who's going to read it. And then how to go about disclosing different aspects of my identity. So a good place to do that could be either the personal statement or the diversity statement or an addenda. So you've got a lot of different options to disclose different aspects of your identity, but again, you don't have to do that if you don't want to. This can be really helpful for an admissions committee to see, because it helps them to understand who you are as a whole applicant and what you would bring to their law school in terms of that their ability to build out a law school class that is different from each other. So if they wouldn't know it otherwise based on your application, it can be really helpful to include that in your either your personal statement or your diversity statement. And then what if I have an extenuating circumstance that impacted my GPA or level of experience? That is a good case for an addenda. So you don't need to feel like you have to write about that in the personal statement, because that often is something that's a little negative or something that is maybe a weakness in your application. So using the addenda to address that while talking about something that showcases your strengths in your personal statement can be a good way of balancing those. Again, I think I talked about the next question a little bit already, but what if there's no prompt or word length provided? Then generally going with kind of one of the example prompts that we've seen or that you see from another school, and 2 to 3 pages double spaced, always double spaced, no matter if they say to or not. That's the preference from every admissions person I've ever talked to. And then how do I make my personal statement unique and stand out from the rest? I think this is such a tough question, and one that is really important to think about, because it will be unique if you are making sure that no one else could write this other than you. So each sentence that you write should only be able to be written by you. So that means if you're talking about a workplace experience or class that you were in, that it's written from your perspective only and about what you learned. So good question that popped up in the chat is if you don't address an extenuating circumstance or your GPA, et cetera, is that a red flag? And I guess that would always depend on what the circumstance was. But for example, if you do have a semester of much different grades than what you had in a different time, or if you have oftentimes they kind of force you to, really. If you have a break in your education, they're going to often in the application itself ask a question like, what happened here? Or if you have a break in your education, please explain. So it may be you're basically just allowing the admissions committee to create a story in their own head without telling what actually happened. So while you don't have to explain anything in your application, if there is something, for example, a semester of W's or D's and F's, and that's very different, you're allowing them to just kind of wonder what happened there. And even you can be really vague in a admissions or in an addenda. Like, for example, you can say like, in that semester, I had a significant experience with mental health. Since that time, I have received adequate support, and my GPA um, and like academic record would indicate that I now have am well able to manage my mental health in a way that allows me to academically succeed. So you don't have to go into details. You don't have to say what happened if you don't want to. You can be really vague with it, but I do think that it's helpful to at least address so that they aren't creating a story on their own. All right. So other resources that I wanted to talk about, and certainly if there's any other questions that you want to talk about here, please do ask now. But other places that you can get support is, especially if you're applying to other graduate programs, not law school. I am the pre-law advisor. I work with people that are applying to law school. Your college's career office works with anyone who's applying to any graduate program. Typically, they do have a 1 year out deadline of work. So if you're 1 year past graduation, they will still work with you in the same way that they would work with the current student. The Center for Writing or Student Writing Support is available to current students. The English language support is available to current students who are international students, and then also mentors, international writing consultants for pre-health students. There's a lot of support through the Pre-Health Student Resource Center. I also like their personal statement online module, even if you're applying to any other graduate program. I think it's really helpful. So you can go and do that. Anyone can do the online module, but pre-health students can get more feedback from on their application materials. But there's a lot of different places to have support. You don't need to do this, but if you want, like I said, there's a lot of really affordable editing consultants online that you can just get some quick editing feedback on. All right, question about if you plan to use a law degree in a non-conventional way. Is there a benefit to sharing that plan as a part of your personal statement? Sometimes I do think that law schools don't necessarily, not like they don't care, but sometimes it's not as important to them what you plan to do with a law degree after, because that's something that as an admissions committee, they don't evaluate. Like, they wouldn't say that, okay, if someone wants to use a law degree to go into public service, we should admit them more than someone who wants to use their law degree to go into compliance in an organization, for example. It doesn't really matter to them. So I think that if that relates strongly to whatever you want to talk about in your personal statement, you can mention that, but it's not something that you need to feel pressured to go into the details of what your future goals are. If you want to, if it relates really to the background experience that you're sharing, certainly that can be helpful for them to see and to show that you've thought through some of your goals in the future. But I mean, that's the answer to everything, but it depends. It depends on what you want to do and what the experience is that you're sharing about. All right. So I think that covers pretty much everything I wanted to talk about. Again, I will send the recording, the slides, the brainstorming worksheet, some examples, just some other stuff that's going on with respect to pre-law at the University of Minnesota. I will send that all to you probably within the next day or so. And if you do have any questions, you can feel free to reply to that email or set up an individual appointment with me. So thanks for coming today. I really appreciate your questions, and I look forward to seeing many of you in individual appointments soon. Have a good day.